Namaste everyone, a very warm good evening to all. The history enthusiasts had launched Āyām-e-Itihās on the 6th birth anniversary of the history enthusiasts this year on May 13th. So till now we had wonderful lectures uh, by resource persons like Dr. Kurush Dalal, Dr. Lalit Gupta, Dr. Kashmira Mehta, and so on. So today we have another very interesting uh, book review as well as lecture, we can call it as, uh, on the platform of the history enthusiasts under the Āyām-e-Itihās banner. This time we explore not a site, a landscape, or a folk tradition, but a question that lies at the heart of historical practice itself. Who own the past, who decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. How have historians, institutions, ideologies, and public debates shaped our understanding of India's past? And what happens when competing interpretations claim ownership over history? So we have Shaan Kashyap, uh, and he's going to talk on his acclaimed book, Who Owns the Past? Uh, we are very much glad that you accepted our invitation to do this book review on the platform of the history enthusiast. I warmly welcome you to the platform. I also take this opportunity to welcome our honorary president Sri Nandan Shastri ji and founder president Ms. Manali Momaya, also all the audience who are going to join us through this session. Stay active throughout the session. You can mention your comments, doubts, reviews, feedback, everything in the chat box. Now I request Ms. Manali Momaya to introduce our today's resource person, Shaan Kashyap. Over to you, Manali.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Nidhi. And indeed, welcome back to Āyām-e-Itihās, exploring the many pasts. And as Nidhi was saying, over the last few weeks, we have taken many fascinating journeys to many different places, exploring many dimensions of history. We began with a question in Professor Kurush Dalal's lecture. Is there any new history to be studied? Then we went to the Jammu Shivaliks in Professor Gupta's lecture. And then we explored the folk traditions of Kachchh with Professor Mehta. Today, we turn our attention to a different but equally important question. Not where history is found, but who owns history or how it is written, how history itself is written. And we think that the past is a fixed, a settled, non-variable constant that is something to be just written down. But every generation revisits it, interprets in its own way, debates on it, it has many contests, it has new perspectives. And the histories that we have read so far and that we are going to read are not only shaped by evidence, but they are also shaped by the historians who write it, by the institutions, the archives, the intellectual traditions that they are part of. So this question is very important that Shaan has raised in his book, Who Owns the Past? So it is therefore our pleasure to have Shaan with us to review his book and to tell us what it is all about. So it is my privilege to introduce Mr. Shaan Kashyap, author of the book, Who Owns the Past? How Historians, you can notice, rewrote with re in a bracket. So India's past and present from 1870 to 2020. Shaan Kashyap studies and writes on modern Indian history. He completed his bachelor's degree from the Banaras Hindu University, followed by an MA and MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is currently pursuing his PhD at Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. His research focuses on the social history of knowledge, particularly the making of modern historical scholarship, and its place within society. His interests also extend to the history of books and print culture, subjects that are especially relevant to today's discussion. So over the years, he has presented his research at universities and academic forums across India and abroad, including Humboldt University of Berlin and Stockholm University in Sweden. As a public historian, he regularly contributes articles, essays, book reviews to various platforms, helping bridge historical debates to wider audiences, especially today when history has become a matter of public discourse. So he was also recipient of the prestigious Sir Jadunath Sarkar Fellowship of Indian History, awarded by the Foundation of Indian Historical and Cultural Research. Uh, this evening, we are delighted to have you, Shaan, with us to discuss your book, to raise more questions along with the one that you have raised in your book. So, once again, welcome and over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Namaste. It's a pleasure and a delight to be here on the forum of the history enthusiasts. It was a pleasure to meet Nidhi ji a few months back in Bangalore when we were discussing a completely different issue on Kadambas. And now we are here with this book, which has come out from Penguin Random House. It's called Who Owns the Past? How Historians Rewrote India's Past and Present. So let me dive straight into what the book is all about. Now, traditionally, a book like this would be categorically and very thematically will be placed under the rubrics of historiography. But historiography, as we know, is usually the engagement with the schools, the patterns, the trends of history writing. Historiographies can be also sometimes biographical in the way that rather than studying the historian biographically in their or their location in the social and political world, we usually tend to focus more on the histories they have written. This book is not, in that sense, strictly a work of historiography. The book really starts by addressing a question that was raised by one of the foremost historians of modern India, uh, Professor Shumit Sarkar. Shumit Sarkar in 1997, having written and compiled a collection of essays called Writing Social History, remarked that introspection about their own location in society has not been too common among Indian historians. And then he went on ahead to confess that we lack, in other words, a social history of historiography. So, historiography is out there, though we don't teach it much in the Indian universities. Very recently, Professor Romila Thapar also complained about it. But this book is really interested in knowing that what is the social locations of those who write about histories, who write about past. And in doing that, the book really writes about the public lives of professional historians, not exactly the histories they have written. Now, what do we mean by public lives to begin with? So, public lives is basically everything one should know publicly in the civil society, in the society at large, outside the walls of universities and academia, and how historians have always connected with society and people. Now, since this is a review exercise, I'll also point out some of the limitations of the book because that is very moral for a reviewer to do. Writing a book like this came with certain challenges. So, first, the book is trying to give you a chronology or a time and space of 150 years. It starts from 1870s, comes all the way to Modi's India in 2020, and then it chases historians and their public lives in different ways. Now, one of the ways of doing it is you also follow the controversies in which these historians were involved. Now, primarily, these controversies were because of the four or five different reasons. First, historians became controversial because of the histories they wrote. Now, it is common sense that most of the histories historians wrote at different points of time is usually not consumed in mass or by a large number of people. But the school textbooks they created were made everybody interested because if children are reading textbooks, somehow with children, the school, the institution, their parents, and even the state and the government gets involved. So we have chased different textbook controversies in India through which we were chasing historians who wrote them. Second, we have chased different important political landmarks in history of India, not just colonial, but also the history of Indian Republic. So every major political event that you can think of after 1947, be it the consolidation of how Nehruvian India came into being, how we started thinking about issues like national integration, why something like NCRT was formed in the first place, what really happened after Nehru passed away, what really happened during the years of internal emergency, 1975 to 77. How then we enter in the 1980s, and what were the major issues in 1980s? What was the stand on historians on issues such as, let's say, Shah Bano controversy? And then how we easily and very slowly go to a turbulence period called Ram Janmabhoomi and Babri Masjid. What then happens in the Vajpayee era? What then happens in the Manmohan Singh era? And then eventually, what then happens in Modi's era, which is still going on. Now, it is very common sense that to write history, you also need certain distance from the event. The book initially had planned to stop in 2004, that is with the outside of the first NDA government. But since some of the issues are so recurring, and some of the issues over which these controversies have happened in Indian history, they continue even today. So it made a sense to give an in-block view of what really transpired and who was behind it. Now, majority of the book, at least it has 10 chapters, 9 chapters talk about contemporary history, 1947 onwards. There's a long first chapter which gives you a colonial context about what really happened and how these controversies became important. It should be underlined right in the beginning that these controversies and these public lives are important, not just because historians were, engaging on their own terms, but also because the modern nation state, the state itself, and the government kept involving itself in the affairs of history writing and what was going about history. So let's say the book starts in 1870s. One of the first instances that we can think of is about somebody called Raja Shiv Prasad from Banaras, who wrote a 3-volume, very magisterial work called Itihās Timir Nashak, which will roughly translate as history as the dispel of the darkness, dispeller of the darkness. Now, the book had some controversial things about to say about medieval India. And trust me, in those times, it was not really controversial. I mean, talking about temple desecration and the problems of conversion and how there were forced conversions of the people of religion who used to end up on the defeating side. We are still confronting those issues and those debates. And every day on news channels and newspapers, we see them, we search those news. So Shiv Prasad has quite a bit to say, even though his assumptions about emperors like Akbar was still very balanced. In response, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who by the way was a friend of Raja Shiv Prasad, didn't find it tenable to talk about these issues internally or one-to-one, but he wrote to the Lieutenant Governor of Northwest Frontier Province, Kempton, saying that the state and the government should intervene because this kind of history is really going to promote communal disharmony. Now, 1872, and this debate is happening, and somehow for our learned scholars, for our literate people, this assumption has got stuck in their mind that one of the reasons there is communal disharmony in society is because the histories you read and you are taught is communal. So there's a very, very clear correlation starting from 1870s, coming all the way to 2020s in policy implications, in government interventions, in parliamentary debates, in the way these debates have been conducted in civil society and university, where people have, and scholars and historians have continuously felt that the histories that we teach are communal and that results to communal disharmony in society. So the controversy involving Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Raja Shiv Prasad was one of the first that we find records of. It troubled colonial state so much that by 1877 we had a committee which the colonial state formed, led by E. Lethbridge, which examined every existing school textbook in every possible vernacular language that was existing in British India. And the committee, a 6-member committee, had 2 Indians. They deliberated on what should be taught and what should not be taught. And when you go through these reports, you find out that one of the most contentious subjects then also was history. And the contestation was not just about facts, it was also about the language built up of the narrative. How do you teach history? So, thanks to colonial cartography, we have, an assemblage of different lingual people in certain administrative provinces. So if you think about Bombay Presidency, you had Marathi speaking, Gujarati speaking, Kannadiga speaking people, Sindhi speaking people clubbed together in one presidency. If you think about Bengal Presidency, you had Hindi speaking people, Bengali speaking people, Odia speaking people clubbed together in one presidency. Odisha had also, the modern Odisha also had different problems because a vast terrain was also with the Madras Presidency. So these deliberations were made, and for a few years, this whole controversy over public life of history kind of died down. But then this was also a time when there was an aspiration for Indians to give themselves their own history in their own language. So think about the late 19th century. This is a very vibrant period for writing history books and history textbooks to be consumed by school students and undergrad students in colleges. The institutions are coming in number. The enrollment is not that high, but still there is a very vibrant demand for a past. And a range of people are writing these textbooks. So you can think about missionaries writing these textbooks. There are colonial officials who, in their other part-time job, through leisure, through their amateurish hobbies, have become scholars. So they are writing textbooks. And in their response, Indians have also started writing textbooks. So a very common trope in these controversies is usually a Hindu-Muslim conflict. I'll give you a different example, which is there in the book in some detail, which comes from Odisha, where Radhanath Ray, one of the very famous and first generation nationalists in Odisha, was a school inspector, and he advertised a position, a fellowship, so to say, the fellowship in modern terms, to write a textbook of Odisha's history in Odia. Till then, we didn't really have Odia books talking about Odisha's history. And a school teacher who had some standing of sorts socially, Pyari Mohan Acharya, got this award. He produces a textbook. And in his textbook, in preface, he very clearly writes that this is a European style of history. Now, if you really think about it, this is also a time when new set of history writings is coming up. So European style of history categorically means that despite really knowing what Leopold von Ranke has done to you, you have become Rankian of sorts, which for people who don't know, Rankian basically comes from Ranke, who was a German historian, and our modern history writing usually gets attributed to him, where the principle of source criticism becomes the central and core to it. So you don't really, write about the sources that as they come to you directly, but you examine the sources, you question them, you start finding the motivations of who produces the sources, under what circumstances the sources were produced, whether the party who is producing the source has some, interest attached to anybody. And after questioning these things, after corroboration, after seeing that if one set of source is saying the same thing which the other set of sources are saying, you then go ahead and think that these sources, this evidence is reliable. So that's very Rankian in its aspect. And Pyari Mohan Acharya clearly explains this in his preface, and this is late 1870s, 1876 to be very precise, that he has deliberately wrote a European style of history, especially on the suggestion of Thomas Edward Ravenshaw, who urged Pyari Mohan Acharya that all the documents that are lying in the commissioner office, be it relating to revenue or agriculture or infrastructure or colonial estate and its different policies, should be consulted. So if you start thinking about it, Pyari Mohan Acharya is really going back to the archives without archive being constituted in its modern sense to create and reconstruct and write a history which people of Odisha should have in their language. But the story doesn't end here. And that's why I said it's a different example, because here in Odisha, it didn't really become a Hindu Muslim problem, it became a Hindu Hindu problem. So as the book gets published, price as just rupee 1, uh, a Bengali living in Cuttack called Kalipad Banerjee writes a very devastating article, a review of this book, saying that the book is really insulting Lord Jagannath because it has certain things to say about about the deity's desecration. And the controversy catches on, and people are not ready to hear Pyari Mohan Acharya's claims and defense, who he says that actually what I have said about this particular desecration is based on the records and evidence. Colonial state, through its governors and lieutenant governors, get involved, and the books get banned. And it remains banned for the next 3 decades or so. So, I mean, these kind of controversies that we keep witnessing in India of 2020s is still, it's not new. There's nothing new and novel about it. We have a long history of doing this. So, I mean, of course, and then we get into other problems of how other kind of historians were writing history. We have also in the book tried to exercise the ghosts of James Mill, for instance. So, I mean, this whole common sense that James Mill gave us, this Hindu India, Muslim India, and British India chronology, and then everybody fell in line, is absolutely false. We can find more than a dozen of textbooks written by a number of writers who have really gone for very modern kind of periodization. So just to assume that James Mill provided us this chronology and everybody started following it is archivally untenable. And the book shows, and of course, I'll invite the viewers to go through the book and find out the details, because this is a review exercise. This is not a reveal all exercise. After doing that, the book, by providing a larger colonial context, really enters into 1947. And for a very big and vibrant history writing family in India, I think we are still not doing contemporary history in good numbers. And the assumption goes back to what Ramchandra Guha once famously said, that as the clock struck midnight, that is the midnight of 15th August 1947, historians assume that our work of writing history gets over and sociologists and political scientists will take over. But I think, to my mind, it is not a very tenable and a promising prospect, because many of the problems social problems and political problems that we encounter in contemporary India, even today, have very deeper historical roots. And it's high time that we should start doing contemporary histories, that is, histories post 47, in very good numbers. Now, as I said, the book really then starts deliberating what happens in 1947. And the moment we get freedom, we also land up in a big controversy, which is there is a push from professional historians, and I'll explain in the end or in the conclusion that why I operate with category called professional and non-professional historians to begin with. There was a push from certain professional historians that as we have got independence, we should start documenting its history through some official intervention of the state and the government. And this was not very deliberate. I mean, historians inviting state and government and politicians in their business was not really making the act of writing history political in the strict sense, but it was also a question of logistics. So, for example, Ramesh Chandra Majumdar gave the example of how Lincoln papers have been archived and catalogued and preserved in the United States of America. He said, can we do a very similar exercise about the papers of Mahatma Gandhi in India? Now, these papers were scattered all over the country, this big landmass, the subcontinent. And it was literally impossible for one individual or for a group of individuals to take this massive exercise. So a state had to be involved for very practical reasons. But the state was still then slow bureaucratically to respond to these demands. So Indian Historical Record Commission was already functioning, but the nature has changed post 47, and now there is a very great urge towards nationalizing the agenda and writing the first official history of freedom struggle. Ramesh Chandra Majumdar gives the call. A board of studies is constituted with a very different set of historians, by the way, which in present day India is become a little bit shocking when there is so much left and right is going on for some reason. And the board of studies prepares a draft. The draft is accepted and discussed, but then it is eventually rejected due to intervention of another great historian called Tara Chand, who, by the way, was serving as government appointed secretary to this board of studies. And the reasons then become contentious because Majumdar has something else to say about why the government eventually rejected his draft, and Tara Chand has a different story to share. Now, again, the details of the story, please, I'm inviting you to read the book. But eventually, what really boils down to is that we ended up two set of history textbooks from the same project. Tara Chand's History of Freedom Struggle in India, being published by Publication Division, is still there in circulation. And Majumdar goes ahead to publish his book independently from KL Pharma in Calcutta. And we have similar titles, similar 3-4 volumes of structure, and two very different kind of official and non-official history circulating. Now, I must tell you that this story till date was not really examined in any detail because the links were missing, and it required a great deal of archival work in National Archives of India to rejoin that what was happening. And it was revealing to know that the moment India got independence, we got into this fight of the official dumb of history and whether history can be reshaped and recalibrated as official knowledge to begin with. After that, we slowly moved to 1960s, and for anybody who has basics in political history would know that 1950s and early 60s was a very turbulent period in India politically. There were secessionist movements going on, there were linguistic movements going on, there were political turbulence going on, constitutional amendments one after another. A lot of communal riots were going on, by the way. They didn't stop with partition. A data set shows that more than around 243 communal riots happened just under the prime ministership of Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, with all these challenges at place, Nehru by early 1960s was really confronting a problem which really became a problem in great sense even today, which was national integration. How do you think about national integration in a country like India, which has so many diversities and people are divided on so many different lines? And thus, we end up in Bhavnagar session of Indian National Congress, where something called National Integration Council gets established. By the way, the same year when NCERT gets established, and when one starts examining the archival records of NCERT, one finds that one of the earliest mandate of NCERT was to produce textbooks that leads to national integration. So this is the first time really in official capacity and in statist capacity that we see that history has now been instrumentalized to do something, which was history has to be instrumentalized for fostering national integration. So the national rebuilding, despite all its problem, will happen and history will play a dominant role into it. How does it happen? So digging very deeper into NCERT library, one finds a document, a very slim 2-page document called Screening Record Booklets. Now, what the Screening Record Booklets did was it identified 4 ills of national integration. So there were 4 factors which were not leading to national integration in a strong sense, which were communalism, so the problem of religion, casteism, the problem of caste, lingualism, the problem of language diversity, and lastly, regionalism, the problem of getting oneself associated a lot with which region you belong to. Now, this was a statist exercise because the state really went ahead to define these terms. That what does communalism mean in a very peculiar document production way. And once that is done, one takes a different step and next step towards the nationalization and standardization of textbooks, which is to say that even though now you have NCERT in place, and even though the first set of textbooks produced by NCERT in service of national integration starts coming up by late 1960s, 1967 to be precise, the early textbooks that were produced before 1947 have not gone out of circulation. They're still there. And may I take you back to the proposition I made very earlier that scholars and thinkers and intellectuals and policymakers thought that these textbooks are communal, and that's why they are spreading communal history. Now, apart from communalism, now we have identified three more ills, right? Casteism, regionalism, lingualism. So a massive exercise was undertaken nationally to scan and scrutinize more than 12,000 textbooks that were circulating in different languages in India. And they have to be scrutinized to find out the references, subtle, not so subtle, explicit, to all these four ills and take them out of the textbook. Now, this massive undertaking was going on. NCERT textbooks were produced. Some of the finest professional historians produced it. But it led to a different kind of problem, which is to say that education in India, for some reason, cannot still be nationalized and standardized because you encounter a problem of region and language anyway, despite the efforts of New Delhi that you need to nationalize and standardize textbooks. Because nationally produced textbooks, which NCERT does, cannot really reflect the problem of regional aspirations and the regional heroes in very good numbers nationally. So, for example, somebody sitting in Karnataka or somebody sitting in Orissa, like me, can make an assumption that how many Odia heroes or heroines find a place in NCERT textbook. Of course, there aren't any, for instance. So, for example, we are right now in the birth centenary year of this 12-year-old kid called Baji Rao, who was a part of Prajamandal movement and who gets killed by some British soldiers because he defies to take them away on his boat to the other side of the river. And Baji Rao doesn't find any reference or any mention as a 12-year-old Shaheed or a 12-year-old martyr in nationally produced textbooks. But Odia people have a lot of aspirations and have a lot of rallying behind him as a force. So of course they would like him to be a part of the national textbooks, which of course New Delhi cannot satisfy. So even though there will be an occasion that national textbooks will be produced, there'll always be regional vernacular problems and regional and vernacular educational aspirations, and both of them will share certain contradictions. Now, of course, this is much more detailed and in-depth factually in the book, which one can go and always read. So from there, the simple point being that professional historians, despite their own historiographic positionings, their own historiographic assumptions, chose to walk with the state and the government on an agenda which was fostering national integration. Now, they did it very deliberately because the assumption that was shared is that if you write secular histories, you can mold the subjectivities of the reader, and someday perhaps you will produce secular citizens. Now, all these are very loaded terms and categories, and one can debate it. But to put it simply, secular histories really meant that all the mentions and all those events where religion played a very devastating and a divisive role has to be underplayed, has to be not overplayed. Because, let's say a reference of a emperor desecrating a temple can still disturb your communal peace and harmony in present day India, be it 1970s or 80s, and it still does in 2020s. So that was the assumption with which these historians worked. I call them noble lies, following Plato. So the assumptions were absolutely noble, but somehow the facts had certain problems. By doing this, historians also sided to certain political strands. And now we are talking about people like Ramila Thapar and Bipan Chandra and Satish Chandra and R.S. Sharma and Irfan Habib and Arjun Dev and all these sort of luminaries who produced these textbooks, except of course Irfan Habib. And they took certain political stands, right? We are told in the traditional historiography that has been done on textbook controversies till date is that the first controversy really blows up when after 1975-77 emergency, Congress party goes out of power and Janata party in 77 March comes to power. That's has to be corrected now, because the archives that I have explored in the book shows that we already had a full-blowing history textbook controversy in 1957 in Kerala when first Communist Party government came there under the chief ministership of EMS Namboodiripad. Now, that's a very interesting textbook controversy, and of course, the details of which you will find in book, that how the communist government in Kerala really went ahead to write many assumptions of the textbooks for students of class 4th and 5th, and talking about very contentious issues like what were the causes of Bolshevik revolution, what happened in the struggles of Stalin and Trotsky, and what really happened in anti-rightist movement in China under Mao in 1967-66. So, and it was a full-blown controversy because the union government had to be finally involved. It doesn't get reported much because, as we know, by 57, the Kerala government got constitutionally suspended by Jawaharlal Nehru's union government, and it died down. But the lessons the Kerala textbook controversy really leaves us should be the highlight of the conversation around textbook controversies these days, because we have so much to learn from there. And the book really documents it in detail. So we move on, and politically, emergency becomes a very important, these two crucial years, 21 months to be precise. And we have also seen that many of these professional historians are also dissenters of highest standards. So whenever a government seems to be going away from its constitutional promises, the state seems to be not abiding to constitutional principles, the voices that we hear from intellectuals as dissent, historians somehow from certain universities like Jawaharlal Nehru University, Aligarh Muslim University, Calcutta University, take the lead, and they take the lead forward. Now, since historian is not just a scholar figure, he is or she is also a political subject and a political activist of sorts, I felt it was also important to document their voices, to document their resistance during the emergency years, which has not been done so far in any detail. And the book has a longish chapter about it. And to cut the story short, there were no, very agile or vocal resistance to begin with. And the only way we can really verify it is by looking to the contemporary records, which is newspapers and periodicals, and the resolutions that are annually passed in the Executive Council of Indian History Congress. The only protest that we hear from historians is about the arrest of a fellow historian called L.B. Kenny, who was from Bombay. And the archive shows that that point was also, accommodated in the resolution because of the insistence of Professor Irfan Habib. So for 2 years, the historians largely remain quiet about Indira Gandhi's emergency. But the moment the government changes, they blow up. And in 1977, Indian History Congress happens in the city I'm sitting right now, which is Bhubaneswar, at Utkal University. And when the Indian History Congress resolutions, you read them, you find out that historians have now suddenly become very vocal and very oppositional to Janata Party government. So by 1970s, it was very clear that professional historians in certain universities have very clear political inclinations and sometimes very clear political affiliations. And thus, for public at large, the historian, the scholar is no more a neutral figure which just sits in the universities and produces a scholarship, but is also a quasi-political actor which who talks on certain issues and keep quiet on certain issues. And then we enter 1980s and we explore a range of events that happens in 1981. One of the story I tell in a fair detail in this book is about which many people have forgotten. I mean, just a few local people in Aligarh know it. That Professor Irfan Habib was actually suspended from Aligarh Muslim University in 1981, and it is a very typical and a very serious issue where a lot of assumptions went into what is really happening in campus and how a very senior scholar, even like Irfan Habib, can be taken action against in their own university. So the book really details that episode in some fair share of length, and I think we still have to learn a lot of lessons from it, because the question of autonomy, the question of whether the scholar or the a faculty member in a university is free to speak their mind out, whether they are continuously under some kind of administrative or status pressure, are the issues that keep coming back to us in different forms here and then. Then the book also then documents issues like Shah Bano, issues like what happens to Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, issues like Ram Janmabhoomi and Babri Masjid in some detail. One of the constant running themes in the book is that the book seems to be fed up, because the author writing it is fed up with this constant two sides of every issue. Now, very rightly, this event, this series of talks has been named Āyām-e-Itihās. Now, it is very common sense to know that there are not always two ayams or two dimensions of an event. There can be multiple dimensions of an event. Somehow in contemporary India, we are stuck in the binary of these two opposing factions. To sum it up, the historians think and say, the professionals of course, that their histories, their secular and scientific histories, secular and scientific is the key word. You find them again and again repeated in Indian History Congress resolutions, in their press deliberations, in their write-ups and essays. So their secular and scientific histories have diminished, if not seized, the colonial and communal binaries and influences that our history writing had. The people who oppose these professional historians, and they are in a good number in social media and in media, in traditional media and somehow in civil society now, think that these professional historians have somehow distorted the real, the quote unquote real past and the real history of Indian subcontinent. And between these two extreme positions, history has somehow become everybody's food. And that's why we have this constant controversies about, some politician making a random, maybe not so factual disinformation in a public rally, in an election campaign, on television. And then suddenly you have a historian or a set of people appearing on television screen, debating it and discussing it. So this book really came out of that sheer frustration as somebody who is getting formally trained in the discipline of history. And I have maintained this dynamic that on every contentious issue, let us not fall into this trap of only two opposing contesting sides. And this comes very clearly in the chapter on Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid, which in the historiography thus far is usually a problem of Hindu and Muslims. Now, it seems that the history of Ram Janmabhoomi is over, because there is a temple standing in Ayodhya, and it doesn't seem likely that there won't be any change to this fact. But the way historians got involved in this controversy, I think now needs a re-examination and a revisit. That after spending 35 years of their lives as professional historians, and then ending up perhaps on the losing side, because historians, professionals of course, were always with the Babri Masjid Action Committee, and they believed that this whole claim that there was a Ram Janmasthan in Ayodhya is mythical. What is the lesson that we can draw? And the book really then extends an invitation to professional historians to think about it by gathering examples from around the world, where in different circumstances, historians have got involved in judicial action or in helping the judiciary and court of law with historical evidence. I said it avoids binary because, in a very traditional sense, the fight in, and there are bulk of books coming on this issue, Ayodhya issue. The fight is usually shown between professional historians led by JNU and Aligarh, and then figures like Arun Shori and Sitaram Goel and Ram Swaroop and Konard Est and so on and so forth. I have really focused on one historian who was from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His name was Mazid Hayat Siddiqui. He was an agrarian historian. And how Mazid Siddiqui actually denied to sign this booklet that 25 historians of Jawaharlal Nehru University brought out in November 1989. The booklet is called The Political Abuse of History, Ram Janmabhoomi and Babri Masjid Controversy. And Mazid Siddiqui denied signing this booklet, and he went out to give his reason. Now, the article is easily available. It's not really an archival discovery. People have known about it. People have written about it. The point is that we have to really relocate and contextualize it to see that what really comes out of it. And Mazid Siddiqui's primary opposition to this fact that historians have taken a very clear stand on this issue was that he said that when history is really being mobilized for somewhat communal purpose or for mobilizing people behind a cause, a historian should not enter that controversy as historians. They should enter the controversies maybe as a moral and responsible citizen. Why? Because it is not the purpose and it is not the function of a historian to keep proving and disproving the claims and the facts that emanate from the social world. It was for judiciary to adjudicate on it, and it was not right for historians to do that. Of course, nobody heard him then, and after 35 years or so, we realize that how prophetic that warning was, because as one starts making a sense of the public history and people at large, one realizes that one of the primary reasons today we hear epithets and abuses like eminent historian. I hope some people in the audience who are listening to it might know that the category called eminent historian today is now used as a term of abuse, as a term of negative connotation so much on social media, is primarily because of how historians functioned in the Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid controversy. And of course, it goes much to the credit or discredit of Arun Shori, who also wrote a book with the same title and painted these historians in a very bad or darker light. So from there, we again, of course, keep taking a track of the textbooks historians wrote, of the controversies they got involved in, of how they kept deliberating with the state and the institutions, going all the way through Manmohan Singh years and then coming all the way to Modi years. Now, just to sum up in the last 5 minutes, I think I have spoken my bit. The book primarily does three things, which is very new and which has not been done till date. First, it writes about the history, a political history of our times through the lenses of historians as the actor. So you can find in the book every important political event that defined, redefined, made, unmade the Indian Republic. What we have done is we have replaced the usual subjects, which are political actors, which are leaders, which are prime ministers, with historians. So now historian is the primary subject, and the history of Republic that you read is through their perspective. So that's one. We are not doing historiography in any traditional sense. So we are not really interested in what Romuald Harper did write as a historian. We are more interested in what Romuald Harper did as a political and a civil actor, as a citizen of this republic. Where did she intervene? Where did she didn't intervene? And so on and so forth. Second, the book for the first time has made a way for non-professional voices to be heard as well. So, for example, the whole question of who owns the past is actually a question of legitimacy and authority. That why somebody should really read the histories that professional historians write. And for those in the audiences, I mean, professional is really strictly about professionalization. So when you start thinking about when were history departments started in the subcontinent, you see that by 1910s, by 1920s, there were not a lot of history departments in good numbers. There were not a lot of history journals in good numbers. By late 1930s, we start seeing some PhDs in history being awarded. So the category professionalization, that you need to have academic journals, you need to have departments teaching postgrad courses and supervising research, and you have professional associations. So for example, Indian History Congress really comes into being in 1935. So 1930s marks the period when professionalization of history starts, and we encounter an intellectual figure called historian, who says that now we are the custodians of the past and we are the most reliable actors who are going to deliberate and have conversations about the past. But if you think about the larger life and the larger biography of history writing, you realize that history for a very long period of time was usually written outside the academia, outside the university spaces. So, for example, some of the names that I took very early in this talk, like Raja Shiprashad, like a Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who, by the way, wrote a contemporary history of the revolt of 1857. People like Pyari Mohan Acharya, who was writing vernacular histories for his people, for his identity. Everybody was working outside academia. Everybody was working outside university space. Now, that figure of non-professional has made a return in the age of internet. And the book argues that this is precisely because of the selectivity of facts and information that our textbooks cater to people at large. The way our education system is structured, everybody usually studies social studies at least till class 10th, till high school, history being a fundamental part of it. And when you realize that you were not informed about certain facts about, let's say, Aurangzeb, and then with the advent of internet, you find out those facts, those sources from alternative methods, from alternative resources, which is usually a freely floating article on internet somewhere, or a YouTube video like this. You think that your history textbooks really lied to you and the facts were something else. And to really deliver to this emerging market where there was again a new renewed demand about a different kind of past, the non-professionals made a comeback in good numbers. And then you start thinking about people like Dr. Vikram Sampath, Sanjeev Sanyal, J. Sai Deepak, Chandrachud Ghosh, Hindol Shen Gupta, who, by the way, write with certain political affinities, but their books come from good publishers. They are well footnoted and cited. Their work carries very legitimate bibliographies, and there is a source discussion. But somehow, there seems to be a new tussle, that there's a voice from the university which keeps coming back, because when professionals really review the work of these non-professionals, one of the constant agony and complaint is that these people are not trained to write history. So it's like a round full circle that starts in mid 19th century, coming all the way in 2020s, where there are again a deliberation that who really can write history and who can really deliberate on it. So the book, I think, me being a professional of sorts, tries to find this middle path where I say that history writing in its modern sense comes with certain conditions. And if somebody as an author really fulfills these conditions, their work should be not met with suspicion, but they should be welcomed openly, they should be discussed openly. And that's the only way we can avoid one more division in a society like India, which is already divided on so many levels. So we really don't want one more division between professionals and non-professionals. If somebody as an amateur author is fulfilling certain conditionalities of writing modern history, their work should be welcomed. So that's pretty much it. And I'm looking forward to questions or comments. Thank
you. So thank you so much, Shaan, for such a fascinating review, such a thought-provoking review. As someone who has not yet had the opportunity of reading the book, I'm very eager to do so as at the earliest that I can. What I found particularly intriguing is the approach that you just mentioned of the book that places historians within the context of society and political field, not as scholars, not just as scholars, but as custodians of history or as actors, as activists. So that is very unique. That is something that needs to be done. And thank you very much for that. So very often, as you said, historiography is presented as a history of ideas, as methodologies. But this is a very refreshing take on history and historiography, very nuanced in approaching the history of historical writing itself. So over the past few lectures, we have explored history through various landscapes and various traditions and such. But today, this was a step back to examine the makers of historical knowledge themselves. It was very fitting to the current needs of society. So thank you once again. And we definitely do have questions. I mean, I have many questions because the art of writing is something that interests me very much. And discussions are very important in present society. So please don't mind me asking a bunch of questions. And there are also a couple of questions from Nandan sir. But I would like to ask mine first. So you mentioned the banning of Pyare Mohan Acharya's work in colonial Odisha. And you also mentioned, and we all know that even in contemporary times, there are restrictions, bans, controversies about certain books and historical narratives. So the motivations in the colonial period were colonial, the motivations. But are they very much different from today's mechanisms or motivations in banning those books? What have you found through your study?
No, not at all. I mean, as far as legality is concerned, we really didn't have crossed the line from coloniality to nationality. I mean, just because you rename Indian Penal Code Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, I mean, it doesn't really fundamentally change. Most of the resolutions, most of the ways in which you can really approach this question of censorship or the question of hurt sentiments remain the same, remain intact. In fact, in Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, some of these assumptions have become stricter now. So, for example, I mean, Pyare Mohan Acharya's book was really banned on this question that Kalipat Banerjee's article really mobilized certain Hindus, that the book has really talked in a derogatory fashion about desecration or again a different prana pratishtha of Jagannath. But when you really come back to recent controversies, for example, in 77. Now, in 1977, how some of the passages in Arish Sharma and Romila Thapar's book gets censored has again a very typical story in the same question of hurt sentiment, and the figure of cow and beef eating becomes central. So the Rudolph couple, who were the great political scientists from Chicago University, have written about it in fairly detail in an article where the lore has that a note very suspiciously came into Prime Minister's office, Morarji Desai, and it was passed by his secretary, where some member of parliament had complained that it is very un-Indian of us to talk that ancient Indians in the Vedic period consumed beef. And these textbooks have been written by people of very clear Marxist persuasion. The note also said that some of these historians are clearly members of communist parties, and we need to do something about it. And then the censorship business really starts. And these assumptions have really not died down. So when let's say you make again a chronological jump and come to 2002. So some of these textbooks, like the one Satish Chandra wrote on medieval India, was in circulation for more than 40 years. But it was only in 2002 when Sikh community found out that the textbook written by Satish Chandra has called Guru Tegh Bahadur a plunderer. Now, of course, the word plunderer was in a different historical context, but the controversy erupted in such a big way that Satish Chandra went to give a conference talk in Toronto in Canada. And there also he was hounded, and the program was not allowed to function because there were Sikh protesters going around. So when you start seeing these things, you come to 2007, 2008, there was a very clear controversy in Tamil Nadu on the set of textbooks that Niladri Bhattacharya and Hari Vasudevan co-edited, where a certain caste said that it has been misrepresented in a derogatory way. The textbook, the chapter was written by historian Janki Nair, and it was about the textiles which this community wove. So most of these controversies are really about hurt sentiments fundamentally, and our legal discourse has a lot of leverage to these problems. So anybody can take you to a court of law because they're hurt, that you have hurt their community and you have hurt their religious sentimentality. You have said something derogatory about the things they feel are sacred. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shaan, for the answer. Nandan sir has a question. In light of the book's analysis, what implications does this have for public discourse, education, and national identity in the social media age?
Yeah. So one of the problems of putting historical knowledge always to some instrumentalization. So for example, in 1960s and 70s, history was in the service of nation building. So I talked up in a fair detail that how history was given this task to foster national integration. By late 1967, we have Naxalbari, and suddenly everybody starts doing agrarian history because there was a larger perception in academia that peasant is the new revolutionary actor. By 1990s, I talked something about the Kamandal. I didn't talk a lot about Mandal, which is there in the textbook, and certainly history is again in the service of identitarian imagination. So, with the coming of the anthropology tools like folklore, oral traditions, rituals, how do you think about people's sacred spaces, sacred geographies? History again also starts getting used in its identitarian fashioning, and national identity, of course, is one of those. Now, the problem is that if you allow national identity to foster, how can you stop somebody's caste identity, which is getting legitimation from history writing, for instance, or somebody's gender identity? I mean, women history and feminism is one of the most dominant historiographic strands today. So I think for public discourse and intervention, right now the debate should move far ahead than where it is. So, for example, personally, I felt that the new set of textbooks were more problematic than the old set of textbooks because somehow the information gets so cramped that you cannot teach 600 years of medieval period in 40 pages of a chapter. It's so much. I mean, you have a passing reference of Sher Shah Suri, but and the book says that Sher Shah Suri did some remarkable things. Now it is for the poor kid to really figure out that what were these remarkable things. So that's a problem. I think somewhere in American universities and especially in Europe, now a new phenomenon, a new textual tool is coming. It's called historical thinking. So, for example, something whenever a historical fact or a historical document or an historical claim appears on your mobile phone, on your mobile screen, the education system needs to give certain training that how do you really differentiate information from disinformation or misinformation. Now we see very eminent people getting trapped in this whole business of fake news. People share fake news and then they realize what they have done with the mobile phone. And there's a very interesting book by Sam Weinberg. He's a psychologist in Stanford University. The book is titled Why Read History When It Is on Your Phone. Now a lot of people think that history is something that you can really Google it up, and many people still think that why these people are doing PhDs in history when whatever was Battle of Plassey and Battle of Panipat, we read it in the school, because history is nothing new. So Weinberg made this very important psychological argument, and he says that there is no tool in our education system that how do we really filter information from misinformation. And I think one of the policy implications of the book makes this suggestion very implicitly is that we need to go towards that, because with the cheap internet and a smartphone in every hand, now your phone is the screen is the floodgate of information has opened up. And that's why this whole new phenomenon called WhatsApp University. Now, a historian can make an argument that every age had its WhatsApp University, but the dissemination was not that quick. So, in 1960s, you can think of a figure like um, Neelkant Oak, who wrote these very popular paperbacks making claims like Taj Mahal was Tejo Mahalya, Christianity was Krishna Niti, what is there in Makkah is a Shivling, and all these things are still floating around today in WhatsApp. So the WhatsApp University was also there in 1960s. Dissemination was not that quick. So now it's a new challenge that the dissemination has become very quick and frequent.
Indeed, and the scale, not just the pace, but the scale at which it is happening, it is very difficult to counter that. So, absolutely. I have another question. Your book spans 150 years of historical writing. So, looking across that period, what would you identify as the most significant shifts in the way India's past has been interpreted? I know you have covered the points throughout your talk, but just if you could just highlight.
Yeah, so the shifts are very clear in the national motivations of writing history. It's not really very historiographic. So today, many important people who are selling goods books in very good numbers make this assumption, which makes this claim, which is completely false and flawed, that somehow by 1960s, Marxists dominated the academia and nationalist historians were forgotten. It's really untrue. You start seeing projects like Comprehensive History of India, which was commissioned and constituted by Indian History Congress, and you see people like R.C. Majumdar and R.S. Sharma rubbing shoulders in the same project. So they were very much there. Very recently, and I have written about this in my book because it comes from the archival record, and Romila Thapar in her recently published memoir testifies that it was R.C. Majumdar who first invited her to write the class 6 textbook called Ancient India. So there was a constant dialogue and discussion between these group of scholars with different motivations. There was no such cultural or intellectual animosity, which some people are claiming existed. The motivations really changed with the how national politics has changed. So by 1970s, 1980s, everybody is clear that history has to be fashioned for national rebuilding and for really blunting the sharp edges of the dividing tools of communalism and casteism and so forth. By mid 1980s, some professional historians like Bipin Chandra and Irfan Habib, who were very much instrumental not just in writing textbooks but in most of the leading educational and policy organizations like UGC and ICHR and ICSSR, they started admitting, and it's on record. There are longish speeches in Indian History Congress forums and so on and so forth, and various memorial lectures, that the textbooks that they produced in New Delhi haven't reached to vernacular spaces. The historiography that they created, which by the way they thought is superior knowledge, which really gets you away from the very laid back old style political history. The questions of social history and economic history and cultural history becomes more central and more superior knowledge. They didn't really reach to different universities in vernacular space at the same pace. So I mean, if one just compares the curriculum of what was being taught in an MA history course in 1975 in Jawaharlal Nehru University and what was being taught, let's say, in Madras University or in a university in Karnataka, that difference becomes very clear to see that others didn't catch up to what these great professional historians were doing. So yeah, that's that. So one very clearly sees this shift with the shift in the changes in political and national history. I mean, this division, especially, we are talking a lot in the terms of left and right, and it is a very clear post 2014 phenomenon. So the divisions, as they have sharpened at the top, has somehow then percolated at the bottom.
Absolutely. And as you pointed out, history can be used as a tool to blunt out the sharp edges, but it can also be used to create more division as it is being used. So, such discourses are very important in that direction. Another question that I have, I read in your introduction that you are a historian of knowledge. So, as a historian of knowledge, what interests you more? The evidence that has survived or the evidence that has been lost over the um, period of time?
So I think as students of history, our primary work is retrieving that has been lost. I mean, archaeologists do that in a different fashion. Modern historians do it in a different fashion. We have a site called Archive to work with, which is also a physical building. But then you also constitute your own archive when you are, constituting a problem in a different way. So let me take this opportunity to talk in very briefly in 2 minutes about the sources that have really gone into this book. Now, one of the problems that when you start writing about historians as primary subjects, what are the sources that you're going to bring in? The first problem is the complete absence of memoirs and autobiographies. Now, in the people, historians writing in English language, only the economic historian Tapan Ray Chaudhary has left a very beautiful memoir. It's called The Home and the World. Uh, K.M. Panikkar, Sardar K.M. Panikkar, not K.N. Panikkar, wrote a memoir of some sorts. B. Sheikh Ali wrote a very self-congratulatory memoir, but that's pretty much it. In vernaculars, we have memoirs in good numbers. So Ramesh Chandra Majumdar wrote Smriti Jivanodevi in Bangla. Kalindi Charan Panigrahi wrote a very extensive memoir in Odia. There are a good number of memoirs in Marathi. But the prominent actors that we are talking about, thank God, Professor Thapar gave us a memoir last month. That also makes a case for bringing a second edition of my book, because I'll be now using a lot of evidence from there. But Bipan Chandra, Irfan Habib, and R.S. Sharma, Satish Chandra, and not their private papers are available in any case. So let's say if you compare it from Western examples, uh, Eric Hobsbawm, the great Marxist British historian, wrote a very extensive memoir. He kept giving very memoir-like interviews, and then he left a bulk of papers that now rests with Warwick University, based on which Richard Evans has now written a very critically acclaimed 8-page long biography. So we know very intimate details about Hobsbawm in a way which in our case we can never know. So what one really relies on, then the question comes that what survives and what is lost. And between the survival and loss, there is this very pertinent act of retrieval. Now, thankfully, we have a very rich print culture, and one can go and find out a number of newspapers and journals and seminar reports and memorial lectures that have been published as booklet, where you can keep finding the intervention these historians made. Now, based on these sources which have been printed, one can then reconstruct a life of a historian who has not left a memoir, because one is not really primarily interested in their personal intimate life. One is interested in their public lives, and public lives are documented in the newspapers and journals and periodicals. So that's the bulk of sources that have gone in this book. For the period where there are no sources, for initial chapters, for colonial India, for the official history project that I talked about, R.C. Majumdar and Tarachand, we have a bulk of archival records in National Archive of India, in different state archives. So yeah, that has been utilized.
And I think perhaps with the coming of social media, it will be these posts, I think they will record more in detail what historians want to say to the society, because now they can come out and say it on their social media platforms. So maybe in future, when somebody is taking up this task, it will be a lot easier for them, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like me is already into it, and I also urge your viewers to do it. So many of these prominent historians are now active on X and Facebook and other forums. So whenever there's a controversy, I mean, my antenna becomes very alert, and it's a good practice to keep the screenshots, because
Yes.
30 years down the line they'll be primary sources of sorts. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's another question from Nandan sir. I know that you have already addressed this, but I'll just read the question out. How does this book trace the evolution of Indian historiography from colonial era constructions to post-independence and contemporary debates? I think you have given the account throughout your talk.
I mean, most of it has been answered, but let me add a small bit very quickly in a minute. So, the problem of the way we teach historiography, and I also take some, I have taken some MA classes, so I'll know that historiographic assumptions in India usually operate in categories. So you are taught about communal historians, nationalist historians, Marxist historians, maybe something about subalterns, or imperialist historians with the Cambridge School and Bailey and Washbrook and everybody. But what it doesn't do is it really doesn't teach you to read the text and histories they wrote closely so that you really make sense of what is Marxist about Marxist history. So, for example, if I give you two accounts of civil disobedience movement, respectively from the text from the books written by Bipan Chandra and Sumit Sarkar, and ask an undergrad student that compare civil disobedience movement in these two books and tell me what is Marxist about it, they might not they might not be able to answer, because what really goes into Marxist histories has not been clearly explained. And then in this very clear binary of right and left and Marxist and non-Marxist and nationalist, we have forgotten that there were a variety of Marxist histories that is still are there. So for example, one of the primary criticisms of historians not speaking a lot in the emergency years in my book, and I have made sure it doesn't come from the so-called right wing, but it comes from the left wing. So Ashish Nandi and N. Ram, who goes on to become the chief editor of The Hindu, criticize R.S. Sharma and Bipan Chandra that you as historians didn't say much in emergency years. Just to make this simple point clear to a present day reader, that it was not always a very clear left-right scenario. There were different varieties of left who had a lot more infighting to handle than to confront a right wing together. And similarly, there were shades of right wings who also had a lot of infighting to do. So, yes.
Indeed. Thank you for highlighting the multi-layered scenario of historical writing and any other element in that case. Here, I have two last questions. One, today, historical debates increasingly taking place outside universities. As you said, historical writing has always taken place outside universities. But today it is especially rampant in social media, on podcasts and YouTube. How has this changed the role of historian, and should historians or history scholars actively engage with such public discourse, or does it affect the objectivity of what we are trying to say?
So, I mean, one of the very key terms these days is public history and public historian. It comes from an American historian in 1977 who first coined it, John Kenney. And Kenney defined public historian very clearly as professionals really intervening on issues of public interest through their expertise. So a professional historian was always meant to be a public historian. And the cases like somebody as senior as Romila Thapar choosing to write a class 6 textbook is an example of public history at its best. Or a Bipan Chandra doing a class 11th freedom struggle textbook. So, I mean, really toning down the challenges and problems of your expertise to make history, very palatable for school kids, right? So that's public history at its best. Now the nature of public history has changed dramatically. And I think historians will have to engage. There is no other way. I mean, you cannot, retreat into universities and say that whatever is happening on YouTube is not so historical, or somebody whose books sell more than you. So, for example, Dr. Vikram Sampath is selling his books in very good numbers. Those numbers can make a professional historian very jealous, and people are reading it. So, what do you do? I mean, can then you say that, oh, they should not write history? They're writing good histories. The quality of what is good has a spectrum. It can also, it can be good and decent, and it can also be not so. So I don't want to use that term, but I mean, that's there and people are consuming it. So my primary problem, and that should be the problem of everybody else on the professional side, is that the issue is not really who is writing and producing these histories, these podcasts, these audio and video commentaries, or who is intervening on a news channel. The issue is that people are consuming it, and there is a vast demand for these podcasts. So you should also come and make your presence felt in that space. And that's why, I mean, the whole urgency in producing this book was absolutely that. I mean, I can already see some of its limitations. Some of the conclusions are a quick draw, but uh, the very quickness with which this book has to be written and then published was precisely to make this intervention, because that intervention was also getting divided on this very clear line of professionals and non-professionals. So I said, at least we can, try to make some bridge, and let's see where it takes us.
That's a very, very wonderful approach to this question. Thank you very much. There is a question from Saurabh Singh ji. It's a three-part. I think there are three different comments, so I'll read them out. Historically, intellectual figures like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and Raja Shiv Prasad Sitare Hind held deeply contrasting yet deeply engaged views, maintaining a robust, continuous dialogue. Today, however, contemporary social scientists often appear to operate in ideological silos, taking singular, non-intersecting paths. So, what structural, institutional, or cultural shifts have caused this decline in constructive cross-ideological discourse within modern social science?
I think partly the question was answered before, but just to revisit it, I mean, the stakes that are political have become very clear. So, as I said, by late 1970s, especially the way historians responded to emergency, uh, sent this message very clearly to people out there that historians have chosen to get themselves aligned with certain political trajectories and criticizing and opposing others. So it's very commonsensical that whenever there is a regime change in Delhi, there'll be repercussions for those who were associating and affiliating themselves with the previous regimes. Now, of course, the book would have become very controversial if I would have talked about certain people who still find a way to operate from both the sides by switching allegiance. But I mean, I have avoided. There's a lot of controversy going on here already. I mean, that's a controversy one should avoid. But just to react to what Saurav is saying, I'm just going to read one paragraph from my acknowledgement that really tries to answer that why should a young student of history attempt a reassessment of public lives of eminent historians? Is it an overreach? And I feel it is an overreach, and therefore a justification should be there. That in contemporary India, history with a capital H has become a fraught public terrain. That's common sense, and that is visible to anybody who see the world out there. Its interpretation carries stakes that are intellectual, political, and sometimes violently social. Misreadings can inflame streets. Preferences in historiography can influence careers. And the preference in historiography is not just a careerist question, it is also a completely political question. So, people in colonial times, people at least in Nehruvian India, were very different. I mean, the board of editors that I talked about, that R.C. Majumdar led, also had people like Muhammad Habib, for instance, who had a completely different view of what the raids of Ghazni, the way they should be seen. It also had K. Nilkantha Shastri on it. It also had Professor Mahmood on it. So it was a very different mixed bag of people who still sorted out their differences and produced some history in the service of the nation. That cannot be done today. You cannot think of a BJP government appointing, let's say, a Romila Thapar on any government committee. And I don't think Professor Thapar will also accept it. So it's both ways.
Indeed. As a student of history, I've always heard this one thing. History is written by the victors. But what I have realized over the course of my study is the one who writes history becomes a victor. So I think that was brought out very well throughout this discussion that we had. And to sum everything up and to know a little bit more about your book before I get to read it, this last question from me: what was the most difficult chapter to write, and why?
I mean, the whole book was very difficult to write because, see, I have a small pocket size book here, which is Thomas Carlyle's On Hero and Hero Worship. And we know that the hero theory has really dictated our history for a very long time. In the fifth chapter of this book, lecture 5, Carlyle talks about the hero as man of letters, and he shows that hero gods, prophets, poets, and priests are form of heroism that belong to the old ages. The new age will now have a hero who is a man of letters. Now, one of the greatest challenge of writing somebody like a figure like Professor Thapar or a figure like Professor Irfan Habib is that the moment you tend to disagree with them on certain issues, and especially in a very binary laden hostile times like ours, you will be branded in a certain way. So you're just walking around a lot of eggshells where you want to write your story, write your history, you want to keep the balance, you want to keep the sacredness of the facts aligned, you want to call out the mistakes that were made at the both end, and still you risk the fact that a criticism can lead you to certain names, because for certain readers and certain scholars, figure like Romuald Thapar or Irfan Habib cannot be criticized at all. So that was the biggest challenge. And the book, I think, has delivered.
Indeed. So today we live in an age where asking questions can bring you many labels, many brands. And I think the one who is getting the most amount of labels is doing something worth doing. So thank you for writing this book. And I cannot wait to get my own copy and to read it. And I urge my viewers or the viewers of this channel, this is something that has a lot of relevance today. That is very important. The discussion that we had, what is written in the book, what Shaan has told so far, these are all very important things, especially in the times that we live. So I think all of us should read it. All of us should think on this question: who owns the past? It is something that we have to contemplate. Otherwise, we are going to enter into a very distorted historical. It is already very much distorted, and it will go on getting further distorted, which we do not want to happen. So, yes, I think everyone should read this book. And with that, we have come to the end of today's book review session. It has been a wonderful, wonderful, very thought-provoking, very intriguing session. Thank you very much. I request our Honorary President, Shri Nandan Shastriji, to propose a vote of thanks.
Shaan, before I propose vote of thanks, let me tell to the august audience also that during my tenure for 10 years, 2011 through 2020, at University of California, Berkeley, I had a good opportunity to attend such a discussion on American history. And Another point which I would like to highlight is that you have mentioned regarding some memoirs in vernacular language. You will be glad to know that in Gujarat, there is a journal pertaining to history, archaeology, and Gujarati literature entitled Buddhi Prakash, which was the first issue came out on 15th May 1850. So this is a 176th year of its publication. It is a monthly journal, but there is no break in between. We are very proud as historians from Gujarat that it is being published continuously, which depicts political history, cultural history articles as well. Another point which I would like to highlight is in the textbook, if some of data is produced, say for example at University Museum in Sardar Patel University, in our archival cell, we have instrument of surrender by Japanese army to British army during Second World War, uh, specifically in Burma. So in the textbook, if the content, the terminology of such instrument of surrender during wartime is also produced, many research scholars and students will be enlightened. And thank you very much for your very enlightening uh, book review today. And the History Enthusiast Group will look forward in future also to organize your talk. And I thank Manali and Nidhi both for performing their role today in today's event very well, and also during the preparation for today's event also. And the question and answer session was also very interesting, and I thank the audience also to listen to your book review talk very attentively. Thank you all. Astu.
I also thank Nandan sir for being part of today's book review session. Thank you, sir. And we will surely come back with something very interesting very soon. So if you have not already subscribed to the channel, please do click on that subscribe button and stay tuned for our next talk, book review, or lecture, whichever comes first. Thank you. Thank you so much.